remember when railways were railways? That was when I became interested in railways. The days when every right-thinking young lad wanted to be a steam engine driver and drive old beauties like this one, 5051 Drisluin Castle. Every Saturday morning you'd see them down at their local station with their grubby little notebooks eagerly recording every single train that passed. Does that magic still hold good today? That's what we're going to find out. It certainly held good in the 40s when this newsreel was shown.
The engine driver is still the hero of our boyhood. We can't ride with him on the footplate, but we can collect engine numbers. And that makes us feel a part of the romantic atmosphere.
Romantic? Well, maybe, but those are LMS engines, not Great Western. Just how do the children of today react to the sights and sounds of my boyhood? I was lucky enough to realise my ambition and to work on the footplate in the last days of steam. I went along to Didcot Railway Centre with a group of primary school children. The Great Western spirit's alive and well at Didcot. I wanted to find out whether it aroused the same feelings in today's youngsters as it did in the lads of my generation. Well, what about that then? Now, when I was your age, all the young lads wanted to be steam train drivers. Any of you want to drive a steam train?
Yeah, I will.
You any idea how to do it?
No.
No, I thought you wouldn't. Would you like to learn?
Yeah.
Sure?
Yeah.
Come on then, now's your chance.
Yeah, we're all right.
Don't tell anybody, but I was just 11 years old when I first drove an engine. That was at the old Brimsdown power station in north-east London on a Sunday morning when no one was watching.
How old is this train?
Well, she was built in 1936, Paul. She's one of the castle class, named after famous castles around the country.
Yeah.
And she was used on the expresses out of Paddington down to Devon and Birmingham and Wales and places like that, up to about 1962 when she was withdrawn. And they were going to break her up for scrap at a place called Barry in South Wales, but somebody decided we better do something about it, so she was rescued out of the scrapyard a bit later on, brought up here, and she was, well, as you can imagine, just a pile of rust in those days. And she's been rebuilt here, and now she's in going order, as you can see.
Yeah. Where was the chassis built?
The whole thing was built at Swindon. Absolutely everything, from the ground upwards. Not like today, where they buy stuff from Romania and that sort of thing. In its heyday, the Great Western Railway was the industrial lifeline of the west of England. The heroes were the engine drivers who tended and cared for their locomotives as if they were their own. And in a way, they were. They'd even arrived from the engine works wearing labels bearing the name of the individual driver. Well, here you are, Paul. Now, this thing runs on steam, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And steam is boiling water. And the way you boil your water, with a fire. Not like your fire at home, have a look at that. It's about 12 feet by 4 feet. And you've got to keep that grate covered with coal. So the fireman's job, great big shovel like that. Want to have a go?
Right.
Yeah, just put a little shovelful on under the door, we don't want a lot on. Yeah, that'll do you. Now the steam goes into the cylinders, just like in a car. It's got a piston in the cylinder that moves.
Yeah.
And in being a steam engine, it doesn't just push it one way, it gets pushed back the other way as well. It's what we call a double-acting cylinder. That's the basics. It takes about 20 years to learn all the finer points. Shall we have a go at moving her?
Yeah.
Okay then. Right, well the first thing we've got to do is get the brakes off. So use the ejector to blow up what they call 25 inches of brake. Or 25 inches of mercury to be technically accurate. Whenever you move an engine, just to let everybody know we're coming. And now we're right to move. course of its 111-year history, the Great Western Railway gained a reputation for safety and reliability second to none. Its achievements were celebrated around the world, and it can all be traced back to the efforts of one extraordinary man, Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
The proposed line, extending from London to Bristol, has the advantage of having a commercial port at each end.
In 1833, a group of Bristolian businessmen decided that what was needed to halt the decline of the port of Bristol was to improve communications with the rest of the country. At a meeting, portrayed here in a film made in 1935 by the Great Western Railway, a company was formed to construct a railway from Bristol to London.
Fail to attract passengers.
One thing more, gentlemen. I cannot conclude without reference to the admirable manner in which our engineer, Mr. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, has carried out the task of surveying the proposed undertaking.
Brunel threw himself into the mammoth construction task with his characteristic energy. And in 1835, work began piecemeal all along the line from Bristol to Paddington, where his statue sits today.
Yeah, now who was this man Brunel? Well, he was born on the 9th of April 1806 as the only son of an émigré French engineer, Mark Isambard Brunel, and his English wife, Sarah Kingdom, which explains how Isambard here came by his pair of Christian names.
Brunel was already working in Bristol on dock improvements. In addition, he also wanted to build ships. He was designing the iron paddle steamer Great Western, and later the Great Britain that's now preserved in Bristol city docks. Altogether, this was the classic case of being in the right place at the right time. He'd impressed the Corporation of Bristol with his prize-winning design for a suspension bridge across the Avon Gorge, one of the most beautiful bridges in the world. His family home remained in Duke Street, Westminster. Much of his furniture and other memorabilia survives. It's kept by his great-granddaughter, Lady Gladwin.
The chandelier was in Brunel's house, which was then called Duke Street, and one time it fell. And he was so terrified of it falling on a person that he decided to put this table underneath it. But I'm rather sorry about that the table should have been exposed to such danger.
Everybody has this image of this small human dynamo in the stovepipe hat smoking a big cigar, but just what sort of man was your great-grandfather?
Well, I'll describe him as a man who cast all his cares aside, and he loved to entertain at home. He had a very grand-mannered wife. He didn't want to sit at home with her. No, he wanted friends and people and music. He loved music. And people always describe him, his contemporaries, as a man of great glee.
Brunel was nothing if not original. He refused to be bound by the already existing conventions of railway construction. A track width of 4 feet 8.5 inches had already been imposed on the infant network in the north of England by George and Robert Stephenson. Brunel, however, would have none of it.
He built the Great Western Railway to his own designs, to the magnificent gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, on continuous longitudinal bulks of timber, supported by piles driven 12 feet deep into the earth. There was, however, a problem. The piles were too solid. The ballast subsided beneath the longitudinals sagged under the weight of the trains, and the rails began to resemble a roller coaster.
Brunel quickly saw the error and solved the problem. He took away the deep-driven piles and changed the ballast. But though he wouldn't admit it, he was left with an even larger problem. Magnificent though it was, the track was more than 2 feet wider than everyone else's. He failed to recognise the danger signals. Over the years, a relic of Brunel's ingenuity has been passed down from chief engineer to chief engineer.
Each successive engineer is handed this stick as a badge of office.
Yeah.
He must have had big pockets, but if you'll hold it...
He did. I will, yes.
Dennis Rowell is the present Western Region chief engineer.
This unscrews and should come out. There we are.
Thank you.
The ferrule takes
It's
off.
What next, I wonder?
And get the right piece first. This moves
Hello.
out. Opens that way. Opens that way. Not quite finished. Just the end pulls up. And there you have 7 foot and 1/4 of an inch.
It's a track gauge, no less.
You would put one end against the rail. It's a little bit flimsy, so you hold it tightly. A little bit tight to gauge and not up to Western Region standards.
The first sections of the unique broad gauge line neared completion, and Brunel started to look around for the engines to pull his trains. Broad gauge locomotives could not be bought off the peg, and at this time the Great Western Railway Company did not have the facilities to build their own. Well, this is a replica of North Star, one of the first locomotives to operate on the Great Western Railway. Now, Brunel, for all his genius as a civil engineer, wasn't too much of a locomotive engineer, and contractors were issued with rather unrealistic specifications for building Great Western Railway locomotives, with the result that Daniel Gooch, who was appointed locomotive superintendent of the Great Western at the age of 21, was at his wit's end to provide reliable motive power. All sorts of exotica were produced to Brunel's specifications, but by a stroke of great good fortune, 2 standard Stevenson patentee type engines, like North Star here, were available due to the cancellation of an export order for the 5'6" gauge New Orleans Railway in the southern United States. The engines were snapped up at a bargain price by the Great Western, re-gauged to 7-foot gauge and shipped south to London, where North Star and her sister Morning Star virtually ran the service on the first section of the Great Western single-handed, occasionally helped out by such of Brunel's exotica as Gooch could persuade into uncertain life. Not a very auspicious start. And so the great day arrived, and North Star worked the first train from Paddington to Maidenhead Riverside. Apparently without smoke, steam or fire, if you believe this 1935 reconstruction. Maidenhead Riverside, or Taplow as present-day commuters know it. It was completely rebuilt in 1884, but the old atmosphere lingers on. Apart from improving communications, the railways also brought about a revolution in timekeeping throughout the length and breadth of Britain.
Previous to the opening of the railways, people had gone by their own church clocks, and there were wide variations of as much as half an hour between the time in adjacent villages. Anyway, with the coming of the railways, the Greenwich time signal would be received at Paddington. The guard of the first down train would set his watch by the Greenwich time signal, and the station master at every station where the train stopped would set his station clock by that guard's watch. So the unified time spread throughout the country, superseding the old system whereby it could be 7 o'clock in one village and 7:30 in the next, and nobody the wiser.
By 1838, the railway was open as far as Maidenhead Riverside, but between here and Bristol lay the River Thames. To an engineer of Brunel's standing, this was a relatively minor challenge, and with typical panache, he came up with a solution that was not to everyone's liking. His professional colleagues viewed his designs for a bridge with grave misgivings.
Yeah, the bridge over the Thames at Maidenhead was engineered in Brunel's usual bold style, with the flattest and widest brick arches ever seen in this country. Well, the collapse of the whole thing was confidently predicted under the weight of the first train to cross it. Well, such was the unease over the safety of this bridge that it was insisted that Brunel left in position the wooden supports used during construction of the arch. These were in fact damaged by a storm and fell down of their own accord. Needless to say, the bridge didn't collapse and is still standing. Further west, there was another obstacle, high ground to the east of Reading. The Stevensons would have probably tunnelled their way through it, but Brunel made a great earth-moving gesture. Well, this is the great cutting at Sonning, just east of Reading. From 1835 to 1839, literally thousands of men and nearly 100 horses laboured night and day in all weathers to shift millions of tonnes of soil. All by hand, with no mechanical aid of any sort, and the job was completed in just over 3 years. The millions of cubic feet excavated from Sonning cutting didn't go to waste. It was used to construct the embankments further down the line. Brunel needed to keep his line as nearly level as possible. He did so by following the valleys of the Thames and the Avon. But to the east of Bath, he again faced a massive problem: how to get through the hills where the valleys petered out. And this is a clue as to how he solved it. Well, here in darkest Wiltshire, this structure. Well, it's not a medieval fortification. Neither is it a Martello Tower against Napoleonic invasion. It's not even the village septic tank. It's another Brunel triumph. It's a ventilation shaft 300 feet deep, straight down to Box Tunnel to allow the smoke and steam from the engines to escape. Box Tunnel being another Brunel masterpiece, over a mile long, dead straight, through solid rock, rather than go the long way round as Stevenson would have done. It was cannily cut to provide a lot of building stone for other works on the Great Western Railway, which would have to have been bought from quarries otherwise at vast expense. Some of the stone from Box Tunnel found its way to another mammoth enterprise, the building of a new factory at Swindon. The railway passed through southern England, which had no tradition of mechanical engineering. Brunel and Daniel Gooch started their own industrial revolution. In 1840, Brunel established at Swindon in rural Wiltshire a locomotive repair works. There were obvious difficulties in founding such an establishment in such a location, and over the next few years a whole new town was built at Swindon by the railway company and a whole workforce imported. To accommodate the workforce, brought in mainly from the north of England and Wales, the company built terraces of small but comfortable cottages. Life in Swindon flourished under the benevolent eye of the company. This hospital, now a community centre, was set up by the newly formed Medical Fund Society. Each worker contributed 4p a week to the scheme, and 100 years later it was to provide a model for the National Health Service. The men formed a Mechanics Institute, where they mastered the skills of the new world of steam engineering. Even their spiritual needs were catered for by the company, who built this church beside the works. The children were not neglected either. They were educated in this school, again provided by the Great Western Railway. Cosy and cosseted, it's not difficult to imagine what life was like in this close-knit community. One of the houses has been restored by the Swindon Village Trust exactly as it would have appeared around the turn of the century. It was home for a foreman from the loco works and his family. In the 1840s, as in the days of stagecoach travel, railway journeys were punctuated by stops for refreshment. Catering facilities were set up on the station at Swindon. Yeah, the Swindon Refreshment Room has its own particular niche in Great Western Railway history. Being a convenient place midway on the line, it was the ideal site for the setting up of refreshment rooms. The proprietors of the refreshment room secured with the Great Western a contract which would be the envy of any such proprietor today. They had built into their contract a clause requiring the Great Western Railway to stop all trains at Swindon for at least 10 minutes. The refreshment rooms opened with the line in 1840 to paeans of praise for the standards of their catering. But as with most monopoly situations, things rapidly went from bad to worse. And it's not until 1895 that the Great Western Railway was able to rid itself of the Swindon embarrassment by purchasing out the rights of the proprietors for the then prodigious sum of £100,000. With the abolition of the Swindon stop, of course, Great Western Railway speeds from London to Bristol improved out of all measure, and so did the catering. At the western end of his line, Brunel built a station at Bristol Temple Meads. It had a wooden hammer beam roof of almost ecclesiastical grandeur. Bristol's city fathers loved it. In those early days, this station was full of the bustle of London expresses arriving and departing. The roof timbers, beneath which the engines came to rest, still bear the smoke and soot of ages past. The Brunel Engineering Trust is restoring the buildings to their former glory. I went along to talk to Paul Simon about it. Yeah, this is just about the most complete survival of Brunel's railway stations. I believe it's survived more or less by a fluke.
It is, I mean, it's a complete accident. Even Brunel, with his great foresight, didn't see the total potential for the railway network in the southwest, and he built a terminus. It very quickly became established that the railway, having arrived from London, would need to go on down into the southwest, back into Wales, back up to the Midlands, and so the through station, which we all now know as Temple Meads, was constructed. So his early terminus, although a magnificent building in itself, became redundant fairly soon in its life. Fortunately, the building as we see it now is very much as Brunel would have designed it and built it, although at the moment, being here in his great engine shed, we're actually stood on a platform that the Midland Railway Company put in the 1870s. We're actually stood on the position of a pair of broad gauge tracks, which are on what is the arrival side of the station, where the London locomotives and engines would have come in.
So they'd have come into here for water, turning, fire cleaning, that sort of thing?
Yes, just ahead of us, the locomotives would have been detached from the carriages, and the locomotives would have come up light, right into the top corner behind us there, where the great water tower still stands, and they would have taken on water before switching on the sector plate and reversing out of the station immediately ahead of us.
And so the railway opened up the West Country. From Bristol, the Bristol and Exeter Railway took the network into Devon. From Exeter, the South Devon Railway took the line over the southern fringe of Dartmoor into Plymouth. Beyond Plymouth, the Cornwall Railway crossed the River Tamar by Brunel's last great work, the Royal Albert Bridge at Saltash. By now, Brunel was in failing health, worn out by years of overwork. Enthusiastic as he was, even his last reserves of energy, good humour and fortitude were running out. In 1859, after months of struggle, he finally launched his monster steamship, the Great Eastern, into the Thames at Millwall. But he collapsed on board and was carried home. He was just 53 years old. And on September the 15th, 1859, he died. He was buried here in the family plot at Kensal Green Cemetery, within sound, if not sight, of the Great Western Railway. Brunel was gone, but the Great Western Railway went on from strength to strength, and momentous changes were on the way. So Brunel was dead, and without him the broad gauge system became an increasing embarrassment for the GWR. With the growth of the national standard gauge network, the Great Western found itself more and more isolated. This was no real problem where passenger traffic was concerned, but goods traffic was a different matter.
One of the first serious drawbacks to be found with Brunel's magnificent broad gauge system was the problem of the transshipment of goods wherever it met a standard gauge railway. Well, there was nothing for it but to unload all the goods off a broad gauge train and load it onto a narrow gauge train. So at a transshipment shed like this one, you'd have broad gauge track on one side of the platform with broad gauge wagons on it, narrow gauge track on the other side for the narrow gauge trains, and an indescribable chaos of boxes, portmanteau and bags in between.
One answer to the problem was this: to add a third rail to accommodate standard gauge traffic over the broad gauge system. You can see the 3 rails here. But by 1892, even the diehards had to admit that Brunel's broad gauge was an anachronism. So the GWR gave in. The entire line would be converted by teams of navvies to the narrow gauge. The task of converting the purely broad gauge line west of Exeter was ambitiously planned for a single weekend in May 1892. This reconstruction, filmed by the GWR in the 1930s, captures the melodrama of that momentous weekend.
It's from Berlin. He reports that he has finished his inspection of the converted lines, and I can certify that they are fit for narrow gauge traffic tomorrow morning. Nearly 200 miles of line changed from broad to narrow gauge in 2 days.
The broad gauge stock was gathered together at Swindon and ruthlessly scrapped. An era had passed. Punch published a cartoon showing Brunel's ghost presiding at the funeral of his beloved broad gauge. The Great Western Railway was ready to launch into the 20th century. In 1884, a tunnel had been built under the Severn estuary. The task had not been without its problems. A great spring was inadvertently tapped during the excavation, flooding the workings. The only way to deal with the problem was to install these massive Cornish pumping engines, which subsequently kept the tunnel dry for nearly 80 years. With the opening of the tunnel, communications with South Wales were improved out of all recognition. In addition to passenger traffic, Welsh steam coal, the lifeblood of British industry, could flow more easily into England. There was, by now, a new class of passenger. People with the affluence and leisure to take regular seaside holidays. It was the beginning of the golden age of holidays in the West Country. By 1900, 80 million people were using the Great Western Railway every year, almost double the number of people using the Western region today. Those places beyond the reach of the trains were made accessible by the first Great Western bus services. Saltash Bridge gave the Great Western a near monopoly of the Cornish traffic, but a rival company, the London and South Western Railway, had its own route from Waterloo to Plymouth and the holiday resorts of North Devon. The major prize was the highly lucrative passenger and mail traffic from the transatlantic liners, which at this time called at Plymouth. The trump card in the Great Western pack was their ability to run trains non-stop from Plymouth to Paddington, which was, at that time, the longest regular non-stop run in the world. It was a point of honour for the train crews of both companies to try to outdo the other's performance. During the early 1900s, many spectacular times were achieved between Plymouth and London, using engines like this. Well, the historic rivalry between the London South Western and Great Western companies for the Plymouth transatlantic traffic finally came to a head on the 9th of May 1904, when an up Great Western mail train, hauled by this locomotive, number 3717 City of Truro, with the redoubtable driver Moses Clements at the throttle, achieved a speed of 102.3 miles an hour, coming down Wellington Bank near Taunton. On the very day that the Great Western won the upper hand by opening its new, shorter main line between Taunton and Westbury, tragedy struck. In the small hours of the morning, at Salisbury Station, an up London South Western express failed inexplicably to slow down for the sharp curve through the station. It came off the rails. 24 people were killed, including the driver and fireman. The tragedy effectively ended the race to the west. The GWR had won. The Great Western Company now set about revolutionising railway engineering. They hauled workshop practice out of the Victorian era into the modern age, and the machinery was built to last. Over the years of the 19th century, Swindon Works acquired a reputation for excellence in mechanical engineering, which soon became the envy not just of British railway engineers, but of mechanical engineers the world over. One of the oldest surviving machines in the works today is this massive hydraulic press, originally installed to force the wheels of broad gauge locomotives onto their axles by exerting a force of 640 tons. It's still here today and still doing the job for which it was designed. The men who worked at the Great Western Locomotive Works were a breed apart, fiercely proud of the company and of their working traditions.
Well, it was a boyhood ambition of everyone to follow their father and come into the railway works. There was nothing else here really to do, but it was the accepted thing. If your father worked in the railway, you went into the railway.
You hear this talk of the Japanese looking after their people from the cradle to the grave. Well, we were looked after from the cradle to the grave.
Well, the working conditions were a lot different then, weren't they, Fred?
I mean, no smoking, no lunch breaks, but still, we used to enjoy it. If you wanted a cigarette, you got to get inside the tender and get your mate to keep a lookout for you. Tap the booter or tender, wherever you were, let you know the form was coming along.
We used to hear the men talk in here then. They thought that we had it cushy when we came in. They talked of the days when they came into work and they went home to breakfast. And after they had their breakfast, they came back to work, and then they worked what would then be a normal shift until dinner time, as they called it. And the hooter would go. The whole town was ruled by the hooter.
You took a real great pride in your job, because when an engine went out of that shop out here, that was part of you going out with it. Your toil, your sweat went in that engine, and you were very, very proud to see it go on the line. And we used to spend hours cleaning up the copper seams in the firebox, and yet knowing full well that as soon as they lit a fire, it'd be all black again. But it didn't make no difference. That was the way it had to be. All over here was nothing else but engines, and you know, I enjoyed every minute of it. I wish we could get more steam now, but I'm afraid those days are gone forever.
The company was fortunate in having as its locomotive superintendent from 1902 to 1921 a man who left behind a range of locomotive designs which was to serve until the end of steam itself. The designs were based on a careful study of the best engineering from all over the world, and the engines were constructed using a range of standardised components made from the best available materials. The man's name? George Jackson Churchwood. After his retirement, Churchwood continued to take a keen interest in the locomotive affairs of the Great Western Railway, paying frequent visits to Swindon Works to check on the progress of his successors. With advancing years, he became increasingly deaf, until on the misty morning of 19th of December 1933, he was crossing the line from his home to the works when he was run down and killed by a down express. Just there. After Churchwood's death, his design concepts continued to be used. This locomotive is one of a large class of engines that were mass-produced at the Swindon Works. Well, this is number 5900 Hinderton Hall, one of the Hall class, which were built from 1928 onwards, basically as a small-wheeled version of the standard Churchwood 460 of 1902. They were used all over the Great Western system on secondary expresses, parcels trains, fast freight traffic, that sort of thing, and were generally the workhorses of the company. There were 330 of them built, and as you'll understand, there was a shortage of desirable residences to name them after. They were reduced to names like Caxton Hall, Albert Hall, Marble Hall, and there was a malicious rumour that the last one was to be christened That's Hall. The Great Western Railway was by now a national institution. Its publicity department carried its image out to the public. It became associated with romance and reliability. The GWR became affectionately known as God's Wonderful Railway. The company was way ahead of its time in realising the importance of a strong corporate image. Every article associated with the railway bore a crest or insignia, and the initials GWR became indelibly stamped on the public consciousness. In the 1930s, the Great Western Railway even took to the air. The Great Western's reputation for safety continued to grow. This was due in no small measure to a system of automatic train control developed from 1906 onwards. This provided the driver with an audible warning in his cab as to whether or not the next signal was at danger. A bell indicated clear and a siren indicated caution. If the driver failed to acknowledge the caution signal, the brakes were automatically applied. But even the automatic train control system was not 100% proof against human error. One dark night at Norton Fitzwarren in 1940, a driver, under extreme stress, misread the signals. Subconsciously, he cancelled the warning sirens. He brought about a major tragedy. As the Down newspaper train thundered through, the Down mail train, as we've heard, was not obeying signals and ran through the trap point, along roughly by these bramble bushes, and through the sand drag along here. Well, the King-class locomotive, number 6028, King George VI, burst through the end of the sand drag and went floundering ahead on its own wheels for perhaps 300 yards in that direction before turning over on its side foul of the Down main line. As the Down newspaper train went past, the guard felt something strike his arm. Realising something was amiss, he applied the vacuum brake and pulled the train up at the next signal box, Victory Crossing, about 2 miles in that direction. On examining his van, he found what it was that had struck his arm. It was a rivet head from the bogie frame of King George VI, which a split second after the newspaper train had pulled clear, reeled right across both the Down and up main lines, totally blocking them. That newspaper train had the luckiest escape in railway history. These two houses mark the spot where the accident happened 45 years ago. was roughly here that King George VI came to rest, on his left-hand side, with wreckage strewn all over both main lines. 27 people, including the fireman, had been killed and 56 seriously injured. The driver, however, was relatively unhurt apart from shock, and when asked how he felt, replied, "Don't talk to me, I'm a murderer." He never drove a mainline train again, and within a year he was dead, for no clearly identifiable medical cause. As with the other railway companies, the Great Western shouldered immense burdens throughout the Second World War, moving millions of civilians and service personnel millions of miles. With the coming of peace, the railways were in a sorry state, run down and under-maintained. But rather than see the railway companies properly recompensed for their war efforts, doctrinaire politicians aimed a deadly blow at the entire industry. The railways were nationalised. The Great Western Railway, in name, ceased to exist. In the great steam purges of the mid-60s, the vast majority of British Railways locomotives were summarily broken up. Apart from those which were bought for scrap by the South Wales firm of Woodham Brothers of Barry, where they were, by a quirk of the scrap trade almost, preserved in this amazing elephant's graveyard at Barry Island, in some cases for more than 20 years. And the preservation movement, I suppose, owes a debt of gratitude to Woodham Brothers in that there's so much stuff that's still available here for preservation. One of the locos here, number 4277, Great Western Railway Churchwood 280 tank loco. Retired in the mid-60s, been here ever since, lived all her life in the Welsh coal trade. Now sitting here, slowly rotting away, waiting to be rescued. A bad day for steam it certainly was. But many people were determined that this should not be the end of the story. Many groups, including the Barry Steam Locomotive Action Group, led by Mike Cockayne, are determined to save as many of these engines as possible. Yeah, most people seeing this lying here, 6023, King Edward II, they say, well, anybody who tries to restore that to going order must be an absolute loony, but I think you've got to be a bit that way, haven't you, really?
Well, anyone who tries to restore any of them has got to be an absolute loony, but this one's got character.
Yeah.
It's got to be saved.
It's got to have something special about it. It's got to be a bit different. If you have that, then you find that people do take an interest in it without anyone working too hard. 600 or 700 people have contributed towards it in different ways. You know, little old ladies shoving 50p in a tin, or to someone sending you a cheque for 100 quid. It's as varied as that. I always like to call it the people's engine, because so many people have sort of willingly and voluntarily thrown money into the pot.
Resurrected from the Barry scrapyard, 7812 Earlstoke Manor is one of a number of Great Western locomotives lovingly restored and running on the Severn Valley Railway in the West Midlands. Here, Great Western engines can be seen operating in their true environment, surrounded by all the paraphernalia that makes railways endlessly fascinating. So, that's the Great Western Railway. Gone, but not forgotten. Conceived by one man and a source of pride for 4 generations of Great Western railwaymen. Just what did Brunel leave behind? It was more than a magnificently engineered racetrack from London to Bristol. It was more than a public utility company. It was more than a way of getting to the West Country. It became an essential part of the British way of life. And the Great Western Railway lives on in today's high-speed world.